Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. And remember, if you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? I have a really great episode in store for all of you today. Johann Hari is a beautiful writer, and he has written a beautiful book about this silent epidemic of depression and anxiety that is pervading our society and burdening the lives of so many people. Lost Connections begins as a chronicling of Johann's search for answers to the causes of his own depression, but evolves into an investigation, a quest really, to understand the reasons for its increasing prevalence in the lives of others. In the introduction to the book, Johann tells us that some 1 in 5 U.S. adults is taking at least one drug for a psychiatric problem, and that nearly 1 in 4 middle-aged women in the United States is taking antidepressants at any given time. Addictions to legal and illegal drugs are now so widespread that the life expectancy of white men is declining for the first time in the entire peacetime history of the United States, and these statistics are not exclusive to Americans. When scientists test the water supply of Western countries, they always find it laced with antidepressants, because so many people are taking and excreting them that they simply can't be filtered out of the water we drink every day. We are literally, as Johann writes, awash in these drugs, and we have come to accept that a huge number of the people all around us are so distressed that they feel the need to take a powerful chemical every day just to keep themselves together. This is an extremely sensitive issue because so many people suffer under the burden of depression. But unlike other disabilities, this one is particularly difficult to talk about. No one wants to be seen as a downer or weak, even though more people are starting to understand that depression is not a sign of weakness. But what is it a sign of? Certainly, there are people in this world who are predisposed towards some form of mental illness, including forms of severe, sometimes debilitating depression. But I find it difficult to believe that the epidemic, the rising rates of depression and anxiety, can be explained in biological terms or treated in pharmacological ways. Johann would say that these are not malfunctions caused by a biological deficiency. He would say that they are the natural response to a deficiency in how we live. This point in particular resonates with me deeply. The Indian philosopher Krishnamurti famously said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." On the surface, things have never been better. This is literally the best time to be alive in all of human history, by almost any metric. And yet, if you look between the cracks, you find people struggling. Some of them are depressed, others are just overwhelmed, grieving, or lonely. It isn't just people in poverty who are struggling. This is a society-wide phenomenon. We see it in our politics, but we also see it in our culture. What do we value in our societies today? Who are the heroes that we idolize? If an alien species were to visit Earth, what would be the appeal we would make to save our lives? It's not a coincidence, in my view, that there has been an outpouring of interest in questions of ethics, moral philosophy, and epistemology? What are we to infer from the resurgent public curiosity around psychedelics if not that they may hold the key to revelation? Revelation of some elemental truth about life that we seem to have forgotten in our haste to remake the world and ourselves along some artificially constructed, commercially sanitized avatar of a human life. Joseph Campbell, the great mythological scholar and mystic, once said, "I don't believe people are looking for the meaning of life as much as they are looking for the experience of being alive." I wonder if this epidemic is not a reflection of our struggle to fulfill the demands of a culture whose values are no longer compatible with the needs of a human life. As Johann writes in the final paragraphs of his book while addressing his younger self, "You aren't a machine with broken parts. You're an animal whose needs are not being met. You are not suffering from a chemical imbalance in your brain. You are suffering from a social and spiritual imbalance in how we live. This pain is not your enemy, however much it hurts. And Jesus, I know how much it hurts. It's your ally, leading you away from a wasted life and pointing the way towards a more fulfilling one. You can try and muffle that signal, or you can let it guide you away from the things that are hurting and draining you and towards the things that will meet your true needs." Those of you who are regular listeners to this show know that I've devoted more time and attention to the subject of life, its properties, its merits, and how we can come to know and understand it as we move into a new paradigm of human experience at the frontier of technological futurism. I'm not sure where any of this is going. I'm still figuring it out. But I feel like this is an important piece of that puzzle. There are limits to human adaptability. We should be careful not to accept explanations simply because they come wrapped in a story of scientific certainty or commercial authority. People aren't machines. Your life matters. Your pain matters. Listen to it. It may have something important to teach. And with that, I bring you Johann Hari. Johann Hari, welcome to Hidden Forces.
I'm so happy to be with you. Hooray.
You might be the most fun guest I've ever had on the show. I was saying that...
I find that very implausible.
No, it's actually not implausible at all. We might as well just make a note of this since we just turned on the mics, but the audience doesn't know you and I were talking. You asked me something along the lines of who was your favorite guest or something like that, but it was difficult to give you an answer to that because I told you I rank my guests not based on likability, but based on intelligence.
Yeah, I find that really interesting.
But I said that I really liked Hannah Fry. You know, she was in that sort of vein. Yeah. She was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun on the show, but you were so much fun. I went out and got you there in the green room, and you were talking to one of the producers, and you were cracking the guy up, and it was, yeah. So
it's interesting because we're going to talk about depression, and I've been thinking a lot here in New York about. I'm a great believer that one of the most important things you can do with pain is alchemize it into humor. What you do when you're in pain is you laugh, right? And I think that's really important. I think particularly at the moment when there's kind of, I think in this culture, a puritanical war on comedy. All the kudos in the social media world goes to the person who goes, well, I don't find that funny. It's like, well, to which the logical response was sometimes there are, of course, jokes that go beyond the line and are cruel or whatever, or racist, which is a form of cruelty. But I think most often the response to someone going, well, I don't find that funny is, well, then I feel really sad for you because your life's going to be so much harder if you can't laugh at things, right? Anyway, sorry, I was just thinking that.
That is interesting. I've noticed that as well. I mean, that's been a big gripe of a number of comedians, either because they don't want to go on college campuses as a result of a lot of what's been going on college campuses that we've talked about on this show, or just generally. I mean, a lot of the more older school comedians, it's true.
I think that's totally right.
What do you think that's about?
These things happen periodically. And there's lots of things in the social justice movements that I very strongly agree with. I probably agree with 95% of them. My friend Andrew Sullivan talks, I don't agree with Andrew on a lot of these things, but I do think he calls it the Great Awakening. And you do get these religious revival movements in various points in American history and throughout human history. I don't know, I'd want to think about it more, but I do think, and I stress 95% of what they're advocating I'm in favour of, strongly in favour of. I agree that we need to band together and fight for much greater social justice in this society. All I would say is we can do it without being humorless.
I think it's attitudinal. It's not
Yeah.
about the substance. It's not about the principles. It's maybe about the attitude.
Yeah, dispositional almost.
Andrew Solomon, another beautiful writer.
Yeah.
I
I was actually thinking about Andrew Sullivan, who they're often confused. So
Oh, you
Andrew
were thinking
Solomon wrote about
Sullivan. I
depression.
thought-
Although I know Andrew Solomon as
Solomon.
well, and I like him very much. But no, Andrew Sullivan is...
Sullivan,
yeah.
right. Well, Andrew Solomon is a beautiful writer, and he wrote... The only book of his that I've read is Far from the Tree.
Oh, great. I read a few chapters of that, about how, children who are radically different from their parents.
Radically
and what we can
different
learn
from their
that, yeah.
parents.
I read the chapter about the Rwandan children who were products of rape during the Rwandan genocide, because I'd done some reporting in Rwanda myself. And yeah, that's an extraordinary chapter.
Yeah, he's a beautiful man. And you're a beautiful writer.
Oh, thanks very much, Demetri.
It's a beautiful book.
Thank you very much.
And it's very vulnerable. And I mean, the one that just sticks in my head at this moment is the way you talked about pain leaking out of you. I mean, the language you used was poignant and descriptive. And I think kudos to you for having the courage to write it, and to write from a place of vulnerability in the way that you did. And as I understand it, this is the only book of yours that I've read, but it followed Chasing the Scream, which was about addiction, which I think you've said also is something that you've dealt with.
In my family, not
in your family,
myself,
not
yeah.
personally.
I think there's an interesting to think about public vulnerability, which is very, very hard to do. There's something about making yourself vulnerable in front of strangers that is terrifying and very powerful. And one of the things that's surprising and easy to forget if you spend too much time in the kind of aggressive, kind of gladiatorial world of various parts of social media, then actually most people's response to sincere, open-hearted vulnerability is to lean into it and be kind. And yeah, as you say, I mean, I opened the book by... There were really two big mysteries that made me write this book. And I was quite afraid to look into them. I actually intended to write this as my first book before Chasing the Scream, and I was too frightened to look into these subjects. I started and I kept pulling back. So the first mystery is that I'm 40 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in the United States and across the Western world.
You have a baby face.
Yeah, I don't just naturally look like a... My mother always jokes that no matter what happens, I'll always look like a Down syndrome child. Yes, partly it's that question, right? What's going on?
The rising rates of depression and anxiety, you said.
And why is this happening? And this is just one of many indicators of despair that are going up. We're meeting here in New York just a week after the Centre for Disease Control announced we now have the highest level of suicide in the recorded history of this country. And that
As
doesn't...
on a percentage basis.
I don't know if it's percentage or absolute number. I'd want to double check. And bear in mind, that figure does not include opioid deaths, which...
like passive suicide in a way.
Well, or active.
Sense.
I mean, bear in mind, more American citizens have now died in the opioid crisis than have died in the Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined. And the rate is still going up and up. So we've got all these indicators of acute pain and despair. And I wanted to understand why. What's going on? Why are so many more and more of us, with each year that passes, finding it harder to get through the day? And the second mystery, which you alluded to, Demetri, was a more personal one, which is when I was a teenager, I'd gone to my doctor, and as you say, I remember saying that I had a feeling like pain was leaking out of me. I couldn't control it. I couldn't regulate it. I didn't understand why it was happening. My doctor told me a story that I now realise was not totally untrue, but was really oversimplified. My doctor said, "We know why people feel this way. It's just because there's a problem in your brain. Some people naturally have a chemical imbalance in their heads, or they're naturally lacking a chemical called serotonin. Clearly, you are one of these people. All we need to do is give you some drugs, you're going to be fine." And I started taking an antidepressant called Paxil. I felt immediate relief at being given this story, and I felt real relief after taking the drug.
Just to set the stage here in terms of timeline, what year was this? When
so
was
I was
this?
18, so it would have been 1998,
Okay.
I think, roughly. No, maybe a little bit earlier than that.
Mid-90s.
Yeah, the mid to late 90s. And and this is a story at that time that loads of people were being told one of the best-selling books in the United States at that time is Listening to Prozac by Peter Kramer, who I interviewed for this book. Who I think is, we can talk about him if you want.
Absolutely. That's a big part of the book, actually.
And I remember when I'm given this drug, getting a tremendous amount of relief, and then a few months later feeling this pain come back, going back to my doctor. My doctor said, clearly I didn't give you a high enough dose. Gave me a higher dose. Again, I felt better. Again, a bit faster this time. This feeling of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle of jacking up the dose again and again until for 13 years I took the maximum possible dose that you are legally allowed to take. Sometimes I actually even exceeded that by getting it from other people. At the end of which I still felt like shit, right? And so I still felt acutely depressed. And so I wanted to understand, well, what's going on here then? Because I'm doing everything I'm being told to do by the story my doctor and the wider culture is telling me to do, and yet it hasn't solved this problem. It gave me a little bit of relief, but it didn't solve the problem. And I seem to be surrounded by many people in the same position. So for my book Lost Connections, I ended up going on this big, long journey. I wanted to use my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to interview the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, and to just sit with a really big mixture of people with different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have really low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil where they banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I learned lots of things, but the core of what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are indeed in our biology. Your genes can make you more sensitive to this problem, although they don't write your destiny. We could talk about how. And there are real changes that happen in your brain when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. Most of them are factors in the way we live. When you understand that, firstly, you can see why it's rising, because, of course, human biology didn't radically change every year for the last 40 years. But more importantly, that opens up a different set of solutions that we can offer people alongside the option of chemical antidepressants. No one wants to take that off the menu.
I didn't even bother. I have a gazillion quotes for our subscribers who are subscribed to the Rundown. I have so many quotes from the book because there are so many beautiful quotes that I just didn't feel like there was something that I could take from it without just doing you an injustice.
Oh, thank you.
But one of the things that popped in my head as you were talking is in the book you wrote, it's not serotonin, it's society. And another one about it's not you who are broken, because we're told that depression is a result of a broken brain or an imbalanced brain, but that it's really society that's sick in a sense.
Yeah, society is a very significant factor. I want to stress it's not the whole thing. So there's very strong scientific agreement, at least in theory. This doesn't translate into scientific practice, but there's a very broad scientific agreement that there are 3 kinds of cause of depression and anxiety. So there are biological causes which are real, and it's important to stress that.
I'm not saying there aren't.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make the point that, and we'll continue here, one of the big insights I had when reading your book was to take a moment, step back, and look at society. Look at how sick society truly is. This is not something that's new to me. I've been aware of it. We did a recent episode, I was commenting to you about it, with Shoshana Zuboff, about the pernicious impact of these behavioral algorithms under the surface, undermining our volition and our desires and our wants and our needs. The amount of time that people are spending, as Sherry Turkle says, alone together. I'm not unaware of these things, but I think I just didn't appreciate the impact that they have had on even me. And there's a quote I'm familiar with, but you mention in the book, it's a Krishnamurti quote, which is, he says, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." I think that is one of the central messages of your book. But please continue. I just wanted to make that point.
Well, I think that's really important what you said. One of the biggest shifts that I made in my thinking about depression in the many years I was researching this was I had essentially believed that my depression was like a glitch in my coding, right? It was an error. It was a meaningless error. That's what my doctor told me. Not in those terms, but that's implicit in the story my doctor
Some people have normal serotonin, you have less, we just need to get your serotonin up.
Exactly. It's a mechanical problem. What I actually learned is, while there are some mechanical components to be sure, this is a much more meaningful signal than that. Your pain makes sense. We feel these ways for reasons. Those reasons are perfectly understandable. There is a huge body of social and biological science behind them. And what we need to do is listen to the signal that we are being given. Because what we've been doing up to now is either ignoring the signal, insulting the signal by calling it just a sign of personal weakness, or pathologizing the signal by saying it's, purely a biological problem, when in fact, there's many things that unite a lot of the causes that I write about depression and anxiety, but one that unites most of them, not all, is a kind of very simple one that goes back to the 50s, for which there's a huge amount of evidence. Everyone listening to your program knows that they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you have a future that makes sense. And this culture we built is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today. I had to go to the dentist recently. I'm glad to be alive in 2019, right? But we have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And it's not the only thing that's going on, but I don't think we can understand our depression and anxiety crisis, our addiction crisis, or our political crisis without understanding that we have built a culture that is not meeting our deepest psychological needs. That can sound a bit fancy in the abstract, so let me give a very specific example. This is the loneliest society in human history. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well say nobody. What is life like if you are so profoundly alone? I spent a lot of time interviewing Professor John Cacioppo, who's at Chicago, he was the leading expert in the world on loneliness, who sadly and tragically just died. And I remember him saying to me, why are we alive? Why do we exist? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They often weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They often weren't faster than the animals they took down. But they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to disband our tribes and tell ourselves stories that we don't need them, that we're all John Wayne on the frontier. By the way, even the cowboys on the frontier weren't that. That whole myth is absurd. So we created this deeply lonely society, and Professor Cacioppo showed a few things. Firstly, loneliness causes depression and anxiety. I can talk to you about how he proved that, but he proved it conclusively. Secondly, there's overwhelming social science evidence loneliness has massively increased. So this helps us to understand one aspect of our rising epidemic. But it was very important to me to think, okay, what do we do with that? That can actually feel, weirdly, when you first learn it, quite disempowering. You're like, oh shit, we're up against this enormous social change. But actually, one of the heroes of my book, an incredible man called Dr. Sam Everington, pioneered a kind of solution to that, is now spreading all over the world. And I think helps us to again see that when you understand the problem in a more sophisticated way, you can find solutions that match that problem. So Sam was really uncomfortable. He's a doctor in a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time, although sadly he was never my doctor. And he was not comfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, Sam thinks there is some value in chemical antidepressants. But he could see a couple of things. Firstly, his patients were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable, perfectly good reasons on the Krishnamurti principle, right? Mm-hmm. Like they were really lonely. Secondly, he could see that while chemical antidepressants gave them some relief, they didn't solve the problem for most of them, right? So he decided one day to pioneer a different approach. One day, a woman came to see him who I got to know well later, called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with crippling depression and anxiety, barely leaving for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'm going to carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to prescribe something else. There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was known as Dog Shit Alley, a suite of doctor's offices. Dog Shit Alley gives you a sense of what it was like. It was just scrubland, basically, where dogs would in fact go and shit. And Sam said to Lisa, what I'd like you to do is come and turn out a couple of times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been quite anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. And together we'll find something to do. So we won't be lonely and we won't feel life is meaningless. The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking and they're like, well, what can we do? These are inner city people. They don't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to learn gardening. They start watching YouTube clips. They start reading books. They start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. Even more importantly, they start to form a tribe. They start to form a group. They start to care about each other. If one of them doesn't show up, they all go looking for them. Are you okay? Do you need any help? They did what we do as human beings when we're in tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a small study in Norway of a similar program, which is part of a growing body of evidence, that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason. This is something I saw all over the world, from San Francisco to Sao Paulo to Sydney. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the deep underlying reasons why we feel so bad in the first place.
So a few things I want to mention. First, this is a very challenging field to look at data objectively or with confidence. There's already a lot of evidence that studies in the physical sciences and the natural sciences are tainted with all sorts of bias by the investigators. In the social sciences, it's even more difficult because you're dealing with human subjects. But you lay out a lot of data and surveys and studies in the book. It's up to the reader ultimately to determine whether or not he or she is convinced by that information. I think ultimately, though, for these types of discussions, you can't rely just on the data. I think there's a certain amount of whether this rings true for you in your own life. I don't know if you want to...
I would say a few things about that. Firstly, it's worth stressing this isn't some fringe position. My argument is the position of the largest, most prestigious medical body in the World Health Organization, and the leading doctor on mental health at the United Nations, who said for World Health Day 2 years ago in 2017, we need to talk less about chemical imbalances and more about power imbalances and the imbalances in the way we live. So this is what's called the Biopsychosocial Model, that there are biological, psychological, and social causes of depression, anxiety, is rarely disputed. It's very, very broad consensus. But as Professor Lawrence Kiermaier at McGill in Montreal said to me when I went there to interview him, in theory we have a biopsychosocial model. In practice, we have a bio model, right? So, and that's partly not the fault of doctors, right? We can talk about why. So I think you're right that we need to weigh the evidence very carefully. We can weigh the evidence about what causes depression and anxiety very carefully. We need to weigh the evidence about the solutions very carefully. This is what the World Health Organization, of course, is designed to do. But I think there's also a deeper thing in what you're getting at, which is, how would I put this? I did an interview not long after the book came out where I said something very similar to what I just said, about loneliness causes depression. And the interviewer said to me, well, this is a very controversial theory. And I remember sitting there thinking, how did we get to this point where the most banal insight you can imagine, one that if you'd asked your grandmother in Greece or my grandmothers in Switzerland and Scotland, hey, grandma, do you think if people are really lonely, they're more or less likely to become depressed? My grandmother would say, why are you asking me such a stupid question? Get out of my kitchen, right? How did we get to the point where the most banal human insight, something that is so obviously rooted in our natures as a social species, got to be regarded as controversial? And I think it's partly because this biological story, which I want to stress has some truth in it, has displaced these much more common sense insights and the more common sense solutions that flow from it. And that's happened for many reasons. So the obvious reason, and I don't want to overstate this, it's real, but I think some people take this too far. The obvious argument is it's big pharma, right? And there's real truth in that. Think about Lisa Cunningham, the woman at the gardening program. There is a $10 billion industry to tell Lisa that her depression is a result of the problem in her brain. And there's a $0 billion industry to get her to go gardening with these people. And I mean, maybe not $0 billion because maybe Home Depot make a little bit of money out of the plants they sell, but there's no organized lobby for that, right? So that's part of it. I don't think that's the main reason, or rather, I think we were receptive to that biologization, that over-biologization, because of deeper factors in the society. So I don't think it's a coincidence. Again, I want to stress I don't think there's any conscious agency in this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the biological model rises at the same time as this extreme individualism and hyper-capitalism. So when I was a child, I think when I was maybe 1 or 2, Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families. This is a very core neoliberal concept. And as you can probably guess, I never liked Margaret Thatcher, right? And I had studied the social sciences. And yet, for most of the time I was depressed, it didn't even occur to me that there were social causes of my depression. It's a sign of how deeply we absorb these neoliberal insights, these Thatcherite, Reaganite insights, that social explanations seem counterintuitive. Because if you believe there's no such thing as society, if you think the only locus of action or agency is the atomized individual, then explaining that actually these things are not the result of the actions of atomized individuals, they are in fact the result of deep social changes, the rises are, that sound, it's like I'm speaking in Shakespeare's grammar. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. What's interesting is, what comes to mind as you speak is that I imagine that in earlier generations, the opposite problem would have occurred, where people felt stifled to sort of be themselves. That repression of the individual would have been a bigger issue, where society's roles were thrust upon you and you found yourself suffocating under the weight of societal expectations. Now perhaps the opposite is the case, where the individual has been raised to sort of the central point in society, where society has fallen away, or religious institutions are fallen away, or tribes, or our sense of belonging. There is clearly, I think, a crisis in a sense of belonging. And we see that, I think, in the return of nationalist politics in Europe and in other places, and in the problems with the European Union from a political standpoint. There's something else I want to raise with you, which you're bringing up, this rise of neoliberalism and the individual and Reaganism and Margaret Thatcher. My mind didn't actually go there. My mind went to some other place, something that hasn't really been discussed. And it has to do with, and there's no real word for it, but the over-scientification of society. That we live in a time where everything increasingly needs to be quantified. And even when we talk about this here, now there's been a revolution in the social sciences, right? In cultural anthropology, in evolutionary biology, these fields that attempt to explain and say, hey, look, there's a reason why you feel bad when you're alone. It's because you evolved to feel bad when you're alone as a sign to keep you in the group. This is a normal evolutionary adaptation. And like you said, if you went back to my grandmother in Greece, she'd say, I didn't need a degree for that. Yeah. You know, I didn't need a study, just like, you know, those studies that would come out. You said you used to eat fried chicken. I've seen studies come out say fried chicken's bad for you. Well, no shit, it's bad for you. Yeah. I didn't need you to spend all the money to tell me. But we do live in this society where... If
you carry on dissing fried chicken, I'm going to have to walk out.
You don't eat it anymore. Do you still eat fried chicken?
Every now and then.
I
relapsed, right?
It gives...
But sorry, you were saying.
When I was a little kid, I used to have a thing for fried chicken, but I can't eat it now. I don't find it tasteful. Anyway, that's a whole different conversation.
That's why we're never going to agree on that point. That's going to be a profound division between us. But God.
But your point about common sense and wisdom, there's been a loss, and I think also that goes also with the loss of the human quality of the mystery. You know, I've heard your conversation with Sam Harris. He's obviously a famous atheist. You said you're an atheist as well. My view on this subject is sometimes I struggle to understand what people mean when they say atheist, because Christopher Hitchens was, of course, the famous atheist.
Yeah, he was a friend of mine as well. Yeah,
he was. Yeah. He was a wonderful man. And he wrote God is Not Great, of course. Yeah. But when he was dying, and he wrote so courageously when he was dying on mortality, the way he described what he thought the world was, or what he thought the world could be, or what reality was, to me was very much along the lines of what I felt. And to me, I think we're so wedded to theism as being something related to Old Testament gods, or some sort of God figure that we've defined in Western society, that maybe we don't have a good way to talk about the mystery. And in Western culture, you've seen this rise of spirituality. I'm spiritual, or people going and trying to meditate and finding, people are looking for something to give them a sense of meaning and depth and grounding in this chaotic world where we know, even scientifically, we know that this is not what we think it is. Even the idea that this table is a solid object is not just a hallucination of your mind, but in fact we know just simply on an atomic level it is almost entirely empty space. And yet we perceive it as a solid object. And so we understand that the world is a highly illusory construction. And there's a mystery there, and we struggle with it. And so I think as we tear down institutions and we tear down pillars of society, we're left with nothing.
I think it's worse than that we're left with nothing. So one of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in the book, and remind me to come back to the point about over-scientization, because I think there's something really interesting that you'd find about that. But one of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in the book that I found most challenging comes from an incredible man, you should totally have him on your show, called Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois. So everyone knows that junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? As you mentioned, I am a lover of KFC. And we all know why, right? You need nutrition. Junk food appeals to the part of you that needs nutrition, but in fact poisons you. Something very similar has happened with our minds. A kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. If all that happened is we had emptied ourselves of values, that would be bad, but what we've actually done is something worse. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said. But nobody had scientifically investigated this until Professor Kasser started to about 25 years ago. And he made a series of really interesting discoveries. So everyone listening to Hidden Voices is a mixture of two kinds of motive. Imagine you play the piano in the morning. If you play the piano in the morning because you love it and it gives you joy, that's what's called an intrinsic motivation to play the piano. You're not doing it to get anything out of it further down the line. It's just that experience is something that's meaningful to you, a moment in which you experience flow. That's profound to you. Okay, now imagine you play the piano, not because you love it, but because your parents are massively pressuring you because it's their dream that you'll be a piano maestro. Or in a dive bar to make the rent. Or to post the clips on Instagram because you want to get likes. That would be what's called an extrinsic motive to play the piano. You're not doing it because that's the experience that's meaningful to you. You're doing it to get something out of it further down the line. Now, of course, we're both a mixture of both kind of intrinsic and extrinsic motives. You have to be to get through life. But Professor Kasser showed a few things. Firstly, as a society, we have become much more driven by these extrinsic values, by money, status, how you look to other people. He also showed, crucially, the more you are driven by these extrinsic values, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by quite a significant amount. This is why I began to think these extrinsic values are a bit like junk food, right? And there are many reasons why these extrinsic values make us feel so bad. In some ways, again, I think it goes back to, like, you think about our grandmothers. In some ways, it seems almost banal. You know, everyone listening to your show knows they're not going to lie on their deathbed and think about all the likes they got on Instagram and all the shoes they bought. They're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is meaningful about life. So the average 18-month American child, more of them know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. So I don't think this is the absence of values, right? This is a value system that tells you, if you don't feel good, there is a solution. Go shopping, buy things, consume. Display those things you've consumed on social media to create envy in other people, so they will go and buy and consume. And then the positive effect, in inverted commas, of buying that thing has to wear off quite quickly, because then you have to be made inadequate enough to go shopping again.
No, I agree with that. There's no question about it. The destruction of one set of values implicitly creates a vacuum in which something fills it, and in this case it's junk. I'll also say you're also correct about that, and I want to emphasize that point as well. We live in a society that is an answers-based culture, and when you have depression, this is a problem, and it's a problem that needs a solution. And the way you described your own experience in your book when you had the epiphany on the beach, where was it? You were in
San Diego,
in a vacation, and you realized...
Oh, sorry, that was in Barcelona. Sorry, I had a different epiphany on another beach.
In Barcelona, and you realized that you're depressed immediately, and because you had a story about what it meant to be depressed, and it had to do with serotonin and chemical imbalance, which, interestingly enough, you point out in the book, there is no scientifically accepted notion of a chemically balanced brain. So the idea
that's not a scientific concept.
No, it's not even a concept.
That's a story that was promoted by drug company PRs, which is not to say there's no value in the drugs. There's some, but I think you're right. But just to go back to something you said before, Demetri, that I think is really important and worth thinking through, and something where I was taught a lot by a really extraordinary person about this. So if we think about what you were saying about over-scientization of these problems, as you said that, I was thinking a lot about an incredible woman called Dr. Johann Hari. So Johann...
what do you mean over-sanitization of these problems?
Well, I'll tell you about her, what the insight that I got from her that relates to this, I think helps explain it. Joann's daughter Cheyenne died during childbirth. And Johann became one of the leading experts on traumatic grief in the United States. She's also a professor. And she works with people who've gone through the most extreme kinds of bereavement, people whose children have been murdered, that kind of thing. And Johann was really disturbed when she began working with victims of extreme trauma, having gone through a terrible trauma herself, to discover how many of them were being told they were mentally ill and drugged. So, for example, she worked with one woman whose daughter had been raped and burned alive in a public park. And this woman had told her psychiatrist that as she went to sleep, she heard her daughter's voice talking to her and it calmed her. The doctor diagnosed her as psychotic and started giving her antipsychotic medication. Johann was really disconcerted by this. She started to investigate the science, in inverted commas, of grief. And she came across this really important story that tells us a big part of what we're getting wrong. So in the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, decided to standardize how they diagnosed depression in the United States, because up to then doctors were just using their own makeshift definitions. So it's quite a good thing to standardize the diagnosis. So they drew up a list of 10 symptoms, pretty obvious things: crying all the time, feeling life isn't worth living, that kind of thing. And they send it out to doctors and they say, if your patients show more than 5 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, diagnose them as mentally ill and give whatever help you can. So they send them out and psychiatrists start using these criteria. But quite soon afterwards, these psychiatrists come back and go, look, we've got a bit of a problem here. If we use these criteria the way you've told us to, we're going to have to diagnose every grieving person as mentally ill, because these are in fact the symptoms of grief as well. And the APA were like, shit, that's not what we meant. So they created a little while later something that became known as the grief loophole. It said, okay, if your patients show more than 5 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, diagnose them as mentally ill, unless someone they love has died in the last year, in which case it doesn't count, it's a perfectly normal response, they're not mentally ill, don't diagnose them, don't drug them. And so doctors started using that. But that, of course, started to beg the question, well, hang on a minute. You're saying depression is just a biological problem, except there's one circumstance in life where it's a perfectly logical response. Well, why is someone you love dying the only circumstance where you're allowed to feel in terrible pain and distress for a protracted period of time? Why not if you lose your job? Why not if you lose your home? Why not if you're stuck in a job you hate for the next 40 years? Everyone listening can think of 100 scenarios that would be perfectly reasonable. But that was a set of questions, as Johann put it to me. Our entire mental health system is not designed for questions like that. That requires us to look at context. And we have a model that's imported from infectious disease, right? Infectious disease, and it's been one of the great miracles of the modern age, and one of the greatest advances in human history is you can identify a pathogen and, you can get it out of the human body. Think about the smallpox virus, right? Smallpox killed an untold number of human beings, one of the great curses on our species, and no one since 1972 has died of smallpox, because we use this model from infectious disease, which is incredibly effective. But transferred to mental health, it's not a very good model. Now, not saying it does nothing good. It does have some drugs that do give real help to people. And Johann put it to me really well. She said, grief is not a mental illness. We don't grieve as a malfunction. We grieve because we've loved someone, right? If you tell me that your neighbour died, I'll feel sad for you and for the neighbour, but I'm not going to grieve because I don't know your neighbour. If my neighbour dies and I know my neighbour, I'm going to feel really sad, right? That's because that's a tribute. Grief is a form of love, right? And Johann says, why do we talk about... It's so striking to me. I did a book event in Tucson about a month ago, at a book festival there, and I had an experience which I have all the time, but this particular young woman sticks in my mind. Young woman comes up to me, she's 16, and she actually asked a question. I said to her to come and talk to me because I could see how distressed she was. She said, I want to talk to you because I've got, and then she gave me a shopping list of diagnoses she'd been given. I've got ADHD, PTSD, major depression. And then I talked about her life, and in fact what happened is she'd been horribly abused, sexually abused, and she had a perfectly understandable, normal response to having been dreadfully sexually abused. And what happened is her abuser tells her she's disgusting, she deserves it, she's corrupt. And then what happens is these people, no doubt well-meaning, the mental health industry arrives and says, in fact, you are biologically broken. What this young woman, I believe, and I think the best evidence from all the people I interviewed, including experts on sexual abuse, and I'm sure we can talk about some of that, What this young woman needs to be told is, your pain makes sense. Actually, it's incredible that you survived this and are as strong and competent as you are. What she needed to be told were healing, positive stories. Instead, she'd been given a pathologizing checklist that made her believe she was biologically broken, as well as what the abuser told her, which is that she was morally broken. And Joanne Cacciatore, the wonderful person who's the expert on the grief exception, she talks a lot about why are we using these bizarre, scientific sounding labels when in fact it's just you've been horribly abused. You feel bad for perfectly obvious reasons. We're going to love and support you and give you massive amounts of support to get through that. Why do we have these absurd...
Why do you think that is? That we have those? My answer would tend to say that there is something around the discomfort that our society has, the intolerance, rather, with uncertainty. There seems to be a need to have answers in our society today that is perhaps greater than any prior point. And another thing that we seem to have along your point you made earlier is we have this idea of what's normal. And if you're not normal by those standards, well, something needs to be done. An intervention must happen in order to bring you back to normal. And this isn't just true psychologically. It's also true in the economy. We don't tolerate recessions. Recessions are an inevitable consequence of any market economy. They are a liquidation of malinvestment. We don't tolerate those anymore. The same thing goes for physical sickness. Drugs like Tamiflu or other antibiotics are easily prescribed in order to help people get through an illness so they can work through being sick. But in fact, getting sick is something that you need to, like you said, like your experience that you had in Vietnam, eating the poisonous apple. The pain was a symptom. It was a sign of something else, and the pain was going to help tell the nurses what was wrong with you. And we don't, I think, have patience for not being at the very top, not being performing at our peak. Everyone's got to be hitting every mark and crushing it all the time. And the reality is we aren't machines. We're people. We're made of flesh and blood. We have hearts. We love. We feel pain. We suffer. We feel loss. And the idea that these things need to be treated as malignancies or as pathologies shows, I think, a lack of humanity today that is part of this affliction. And I want to make one more just brief point because
Sure.
it came up to me on my own because this is a movie that I bring up all the time on the show. It's The Matrix, and it literally is for me like religion. And there is a scene in the first Matrix where Morpheus is being interrogated by Agent Smith, and Agent Smith tells Morpheus that there was a previous Matrix to this Matrix, and it was a catastrophe. We lost, untold numbers of crops were lost. People rejected the program. And I think there is a similar thing happening in our society. People are rejecting the program on a very basic level. They're being told this is what life is. This is what a meaningful life is. This is what a fulfilling life is. These are the values that you need to live your life by. And it's not fulfilling. And people are unable to live. And, you know, one more thing really quick I'll throw out there, because I am a great fan and an amateur student of mythology, starting with Greek mythology, obviously. One of my greatest, all my professors of mythology were not at NYU. They were actually through the teaching company, and this wonderful woman.
I love the teaching company.
Do you know Elizabeth Vandiver?
No, I've not listened to her.
She's a wonderful woman, and she taught a class among many on Greek mythology. And
is it on the teaching company?
Yeah, it is.
Oh,
it's a very old lecture. She's phenomenal. Yeah. So, but I also read Joseph Campbell, and he had this one quote. I think it was from a Bill Moyer interview where he said, "I don't believe people are looking for the meaning of life as much as they are looking for the experience of being alive." And I think there is a loss of a sense of being alive. And just to cap it off, in your book, I think you struck a chord with that, because you talked about meeting an old friend of yours that you gave her the name Annie, I believe. And she slipped up in a conversation that she had with you, and she was talking about the past, and she meant to say, when I was young, and instead she said, when I was alive. And I think there is this profound sense of, and you see it in zombie films, I think that's part of it. There is a feeling of deadness that is pervading society, and it's part of this story.
I think there's loads of things in what you just said that I think are really worth thinking about. So Joanne says exactly rightly, why do we have this crazy... So when they invented the grief loophole that said you're allowed for a year to not be called mentally ill if you so distressed, they gradually shrank the grief loophole. So it went down from a year to 6 months to 2 months. Then it went down to 2 weeks, and then they got rid of it. So now you can be diagnosed almost immediately. And in fact, as Dr. Castore showed, 9% of grieving parents of babies are diagnosed and drugged in the first 48 hours after their child dies. And she argues, I think very persuasively, that that actually interrupts the grieving process and is because grief is not a mental illness. But I think you're right. She says, why does that happen? A big part of it is the demands of kind of hyper-neoliberal capitalism. It's like, you've had your 2 weeks to grieve your dead baby, get back to work, right? Go back to the office. And I was speaking recently to Dr. Daniel Sullivan at Tucson, who's an amazing thinker on this. He's a big part of what's called existential psychology. And he pointed out to me, I'd never thought about this as clearly before, but I've been reading about a bit since. If you look at the origins of American psychology, American academic psychology, it's in Fordism. Henry Ford and other mass manufacturers fund the invention of academic psychology with the specific goal, we want to know how to get the most out of our factory workers, right? And that is still very much the tradition that dominates academic psychology in the United States.
Well, B.F. Skinner's work
Yeah.
has been applied in spades in Silicon Valley's behavioral algorithms. I mean, that is...
It's incredible because
it's
so interesting because I'm one of the things I'm doing a long-term project where I'm writing with this cooperation a biography of Noam Chomsky, and it is really fascinating when you look at this real return of Skinnerism, right? The return of this philosophy that has a ludicrous idea about what human beings are, that we're just responses to these very crude signals. But so I think you can see that there's definitely this element of we have a model of psychology that is driven towards make the person do their work. In fact, one of the criteria often in these mental health diagnoses is, can they work? But I think we have to think differently about work itself. So I noted, and this is of all the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in the book, this is the one that I think if we dealt with it, and there are ways we can deal with it that are very practical, I think it would lead to the biggest single fall in depression and anxiety. Now, that's a hunch. I don't want to overstate my hunch, but I think there's very good evidence for the underlying premises. So I noticed that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I was like, well, maybe people I know are unusual. Let's see. Gallup did the most detailed study of this. Huge study. I think it was 3 years to figure out how do people feel about their work. What they found is 13% of us, 13%, like their jobs most of the time. 63% are what they called sleepwalking. You don't like it, you don't hate it, you just kind of tolerate it. And 24% of people hate and fear their jobs. I was quite struck by that. That means 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of the time. And this thing that we don't like doing is spreading over more and more of the day. The average person answers their first work email at 7:43 a.m. and leaves work at 7:15 p.m. So I started to think, could this have some effect on our mental health? I learned there was an amazing Australian social scientist called Professor Michael Marmot who'd made a big breakthrough about this in the 70s, so I went to interview him. Professor Marmot discovered the key factor that causes depression at work. It's not the only one, but it's the biggest. If you go to work tomorrow and you have low or no control over your work, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious. I think, and I'm going beyond what Professor Marmot says now, that this is related to what we were saying about human needs. We evolved to feel good when we think we're good at something, to feel that what we're doing has meaning. And if you feel that you're controlled, if you feel like you're a kind of Skinnerite drone on a line, you can't create meaning out of your work. But when I learned this, initially I actually misunderstood what this evidence meant. So I thought it meant, okay, you've got this elite 13% of people at the top who get to have these nice fancy lives, control their work, and then you've got everyone else who's condemned to the shit, right? And I'm like, well, my grandmother's job was to clean toilets. My dad was a bus driver. My brother is an Uber driver. Are we saying that like most people in the economy are just condemned? But as Professor Marmot said to me, it's not the work that makes you depressed. It's being controlled at work. And there's a way we can deal with that. So it's an argument for a big structural change in the economy, but we've all lived through big structural changes in all sorts of ways. So to understand this, I went to interview a woman called Meredith Keogh. Meredith, she was in Baltimore, and Meredith used to go to bed every Sunday night, just sick with anxiety. She had an office job. As she would tell you, it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or harassed, but it was monotonous, it was boring, she had very little control, and she couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the next 40 years of her life till she retired. So one day with her husband Josh, Meredith did this quite bold thing. Josh had worked in bike stores since he was a teenager in Baltimore, which, you know, is controlled work, very insecure work, you have very few rights. And one day Josh and his colleagues were sitting in their store and they asked themselves, one of them asked, what does our boss actually do? They quite liked their boss, he wasn't an asshole, but they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes, this other dude seems to make all the money, doesn't seem like such a good deal for us. They decided they were going to set up a bike store that worked on a different principle. The previous store they worked at was a corporation. Everyone listening to this knows what a corporation is. Most people work in them. It's a very recent human invention. So a corporation is structured like an army or like a dictatorship. The boss at the top makes the decisions. Sometimes he's a nice dictator who listens to the population. Sometimes he's Kim Jong-un. You've got no say over that. But if you ultimately don't agree with the guy at the top, then you just have to get out, right?
Or you could have a giant asshole that you're working directly underneath who is shielding you from a better boss above him or her.
Yeah, that's a possible scenario.
I think a lot of people have that experience.
They decided they were going to set up a bike store that worked on a different principle. So Baltimore Bicycle Works, their store, is not a corporation. It's based on an older American idea. It's a democratic cooperative. There are many democratic cooperatives across the United States. So they don't have a boss. They take the decisions about the business together by voting once every couple of weeks. They share out the profits. They share out the good tasks and the shitty tasks. If anyone has an idea about how to make the business better, they can persuade their colleagues, or at least try to. And one of the things that was fascinating, spending time with the people in Baltimore Bicycle Works, was how many of them talked about how they used to be depressed and anxious in this previous way of working, but were not depressed and anxious now. And it's important to say, it's not like they gave up their jobs fixing bikes and went off to become Beyonce's backing singers, right? Yeah. They fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now. What's the difference? Now they've got control over their work. Now, I would argue, I think it's very good evidence, there is no reason we need to be structuring our society so most of us are spending most of our waking lives in institutions that make us feel like shit. Every business can be a democratic cooperative. It's not even good for the economy.
Well, it doesn't even have to be a democratic cooperative. I mean, after reading your book, I went to investigate this matter because there are certain businesses in New York that I attend frequently or go to for services where I'm struck by how pleasant and happy the staff is. One of them is called the Grey Dog Cafe. It's on 12th Street at University. Yeah. The staff is remarkable. They're so happy. They're so easygoing and it's just so pleasant. And I asked them, there's also a pharmacy, a very old pharmacy on 6th Avenue called Bigelow Pharmacy, Bigelow Chemists. Same thing. The thing I found over and over again when I went, and again, I was spurred to do this because I read your book and I was going to have you on the show and I kept it in my mind. They talked about one of the things that was up at the very top of the list was that they were listened to, that they were heard, that they felt like their input, their thoughts, those things mattered. I think that's very important. Also, just in the interest of time, Johann, I want to list off those 9 causes of depression and anxiety that you have in the book, just so that our listeners have some idea of that. And of course, they can read your book. And
they can sound a bit weird out of context, but I just stress that's the first third of the book, and the most of the book is about the solutions. But yeah,
there is, and we'll get into that. And there's also a lot, as I said, a lot about the scientific studies. I think the most compelling point in terms of the research very early on, it has to do with the work of Irving Kirsch, which was basically dismantling the data or the argument built on top of the data to support the pharmaceutical industry's antidepressant drugs, which was, interestingly enough, it's an interesting story. I need to summarize it, but Kirsch's argument was that the data didn't support the argument that was put forward, and that in order to combat that, who was the researcher that combated Kirsch?
Peter Kramer.
Kramer's point was that, well, actually, the data itself is flawed, so you can't argue the conclusion, which basically meant that the entire edifice of the data upon which all the conclusions were built was corrupted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to stress that there is some evidence that chemical antidepressants do have more benefit than placebo in the first 2 months. There's very robust scientific evidence for that, and it's important to stress it. But what I found most shocking, actually, and Professor Kirsch points that out as much as anyone else, but what I found most shocking, actually, is that there's basically almost no research into the long-term effects of chemical antidepressants. The best study we have is something called the STAR-D trial, which just is very simple and it's very hard to rig. You just follow people who go to their doctor saying they're depressed, follow the different options and follow them over time to see what happens. And the STAR-D trial showed chemical antidepressants gave people some relief, but most people taking them did become depressed again. And in a way, this was the most controversial part of the book, and I was kind of surprised because I feel like it's almost crudely obvious what I'm saying about chemical antidepressants, which is, yeah, they give a bit of relief, but they're not solving the problem. Well, look around you. I mean, if they were solving the problem, we wouldn't have a situation where every year depression and anxiety go up and up and up. This doesn't mean they give no relief to anyone. They do give some relief to some people, as they indeed did to me. But we've obviously got to have a much wider, expanded menu of options because this problem is so much deeper than just the biology.
Well, I want people that are listening who either are depressed, have been depressed, or have loved ones who are depressed or people they care about. This book is inviting to read because Johann talks about it from a first-person perspective. You give a great story when you were in the office of your therapist, and your therapist said basically something along the lines of, well, you kind of seem depressed. You seem kind of like the way you said you used to be, because you would tell them that you're so much better because you were taking these antidepressants, and your reaction was to get kind of pissed off, kind of annoyed, like, who are you? You know, what the hell? You're going to tell me? Like, don't you understand? Don't you read? Don't you know that these drugs are saving my life? Right? And you're and of course that is a reaction to defend, because the thought that maybe the story you had been told wasn't entirely accurate, or maybe there was some nuance to it, invaded this sort of answer that was helping you cope. So I actually, without going too much in all sorts of different directions, my point in bringing that up was to say that I don't mean by my words or by what I said about the data to suggest that anyone's experience of depression is not real, nor to suggest that the drugs they take may not or have not bettered their lives in certain cases substantially, depending on what your particular condition is. I simply mean it as part of this larger point that you make in the book, which I agree with, which is that there has been, I think, an overprescription, dramatic overprescription of these drugs, and not just with antidepressants, with Ritalin, with Adderall. Kids...
I think it's rather than overprescription, I would talk about over-biologization of the problem more
Absolutely.
Broadly. But there's something that really happened, because I found that very... Of all the insights I learned for the book, that was one of the hardest, right? Because this was the one thing I had been given that I was told would help me. And it did give me some help initially. And to then be told this story that actually that's, you know, does help some people, but it's relatively limited. And that the wider story I was told that it's just about low serotonin is not true. As the leading expert at Princeton, Professor Andrew Scull, says, it's deeply misleading and unscientific to say depression is just caused by low serotonin. I found that very disorientating. If you have a story about your pain, even if that story isn't working very well for you, and it clearly didn't work very well for me, at least you feel like you know where you are. And there's a moment in the adjustment of the story where you feel profoundly disorientated. But one of the ways I found out of that led me on to the much wider research after that very difficult first stage, that's actually where I'd gotten stuck writing the book for many years. I was just like, this is too painful, I can't look at this. And was I went to interview this South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield, who is a great guy. He happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they introduced chemical antidepressants for the first time in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs. So they were like, what are they? And he explained. And they said to him, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants.
Right.
And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy like St. John's wort, ginkgo biloba, something like that. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the United States. And he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg and he goes back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial leg. I'm guessing it's pretty traumatic to go back and work in the fields where you've been blown up. The guy starts to cry all day, doesn't want to get out of bed. He develops classic depression. The doctors, the Cambodians, said to him, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, what? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realised that his pain made sense. It had identifiable causes. One of them thought, if we bought him a cow, he could work with that. He wouldn't have to work in the fields anymore. So they decided to buy him a cow so he could become a dairy farmer. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a couple of months, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that's an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a bad joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant, she gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is precisely what the leading medical body in the world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is practical help to get those needs met. It's important to know what those Cambodian doctors weren't saying. They weren't saying, well, this isn't primarily a biological problem, so you've got to solve it, buddy. It's all on you, right? Because they have a very deep belief there is a society, right? They instinctively found a social solution to this problem. I think part of the problem why these insights are hard to digest in this culture is because if you come along and you say the biology has been overstated, what a lot of people hear is, fuck, so you're saying I've got to solve it myself as an isolated individual. I can't do that. And you want to go, you're absolutely right. There's a third option, which is neither purely biologically broken nor you as an isolated individual, which is we as humans can do what we have always done, which is as tribes solve our problems together.
And there's the disconnection causing a vicious cycle, right? So another interesting point is that you brought up Robert Sapolsky's research on chimpanzee troops or baboons in Africa. And you mentioned, you had a larger point. You had some beautiful lines, actually. And your point was about the fact that in the wild, almost you never see a depressed baboon.
Well, you do in very limited
circumstances where it makes sense. They were the head of the troop and they were deposed, or they're at the very, very bottom. They've been slighted, but it's temporary. They're temporary symptoms of depression, but it goes away. It isn't a permanent feature, whereas animals in captivity behave very differently. And that had to do with your point about nature. But I think the larger point that I think I was trying to make is that we all have tendencies. We know people who tend towards depression. This is not, in my view, controversial. And there are certain people, no matter what you do to them, nothing gets them down. They're remarkable. But I think the vast majority of us fall somewhere in the middle of that. And in a profoundly sick society, to speak of Krishnamurti, why on earth, for example, would it not occur to anyone that living in a city like New York, where so many people on your way to work and on your way back to work, you will see people living on the street in poverty, in destitution, with psychological illnesses, unkempt, physical illnesses, and this is not supposed to upset you. This is not supposed to impact you. And there's so many other aspects of our society that are so sick, which I think drive so many people over the edge. People who maybe they're diagnosed as significantly depressed, but they would not be in a different society. And I don't have an easy answer for that. You have some in the book, and I just wanted to make that point because I'm not trying to bifurcate people here. I agree with your point about this being a larger societal phenomenon and it's impacting people. Before we go into the overtime, Johann, I just want to mention these 9 causes because I want people to have them in their mind. One of them we spoke about, it's meaningful work. I completely agree with that.
Just disconnection from meaningful work.
Disconnection from meaningful work. Another one is disconnection from other people. We discussed that. Another one is values, disconnection from meaningful values. Another one that we didn't really talk about, I don't think, is disconnection from a hopeful, secure future. Of course, people that are depressed tend to lose a sense of hope, lose a sense of the future. I think that's a powerful one. We didn't really go into that, but that's, I think, a big one in the book. Another one is, you talked about as disconnection from childhood trauma. I imagine this also just applies to trauma more broadly. If you were in a war zone and you experienced trauma, or if you had cancer, that is a traumatic experience, and that's a difficult one to reintegrate. Disconnection from status and respect. I think we touched on it here and there, certainly with work. Certainly, I also wonder to what extent this is impacting so much of the populism and the nationalism, right? This huge gap in wealth and power in society. Disconnection from nature. We didn't discuss that really. We kind of touched on it with a baboon. I believe in that fully. When I get out of the city, I am nourished. When I see the sun, I am nourished. When I walk on grass or I walk on a beach, I feel differently. I think that is absolutely true. And I think this is one where we do benefit from the body of scientific evidence and studies because it makes absolute sense that an animal that evolved in a natural environment would miss something from being in that environment.
Well, animals go crazy in zoos when they're deprived of their natural habitat. This is called zoochosis. Horses will start to obsessively sway. Elephants will grind their tusks, which are a great source of
Those
pride
were
in
the
the
quotes
world,
that I was trying to pull from
down
you.
to these like bloody stumps. Parrots will rip out their feathers. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world, that being deprived of the habitat we evolved for, is disastrous for us and being exposed to it. So, for example, the state prison in Michigan, this wasn't designed this way just by coincidence, has one part that looks out over beautiful greenery and another part that looks out over a bare concrete parking lot. And it was a study, it was random where you ended up in the prison, but it found that the people who looked out over lush greenery were 20% less likely to develop mental health problems of all kinds, right? So one of the things that's going on is a kind of zoochosis for our species, right? We didn't evolve to live in these habitats.
Yeah, you write in the book, I don't know if this is exactly a quote or if it's kind of a mismatch of my own words and your words, but you wrote, "We know from over a century of observing animals in captivity that when they are deprived of their natural habitat, they will often develop symptoms that look like extreme forms of depression. Parrots will rip out their own feathers, horses will start unstoppably swaying, elephants will start to grind their tusks, their source of strength and pride in the wild, against the walls of their cells until they are gnarled stumps. Some elephants in captivity are so traumatized they sleep upright for years, moving their bodies neurotically the whole time. None of these species ever behave this way in the wild." And you make the further point, this is why it's so difficult for animals to mate in captivity, because they lose their sex drive.
My friend Isabel Benke, who you should totally interview, she's based here in New York a lot of the time. She's an incredible Chilean primatologist and one of the most extraordinary people I know. You know, I remember talking to her about this. She explained a lot of this evidence to me. She said she would only explain it to me if I agreed to walk up a mountain with her. And, you know, I said, well, what lessons should we take from this? And she looked at me and said, fuck captivity. Right? Loads of humans are effectively living in captivity. And I don't just mean the people who are literally in prisons, right? She said, fuck captivity. No species enjoys living in captivity. And the fact that we are reacting in ways that other animal species, we are of course an animal species ourselves, that other animal species only react to when they are put in cages, tells you something about the environment we've constructed and how we need to change our environment and how we can change our environment.
Yeah, and the last two had to do with genes and the brain.
Yeah.
I want to go into the overtime, Johann. I also want to talk about, among other things, in terms of solutions, I want to discuss the work you've done researching psychedelic therapies.
Sure.
I find these very promising. One of the other things I was thinking about when we were talking was how healing this must have been for you to speak to so many people. Coming from your own experience, I had an experience of my own dealing with death, and I had organized a conference on death and dying some years ago in New York, and I found it remarkably healing, speaking about grief, about pain, sharing my pain, sharing my grief. And I think that speaks to the point of we don't want to muffle the pain. I mean, again, I'm not trying to in any way suggest what anyone should or should not do, or that drugs do not work or do work for certain people. But I do agree with the point that you made in the book about the apple and the pain. The pain is a symptom. It's a sign. It's a signal. It's telling us something. And we would be wise to listen, irrespective of whether or not we take a drug or we try and treat it. It's important to be present with our pain because so much of the suffering comes from being unwilling to acknowledge or recognize it, right?
Yeah, and because we created a culture that doesn't give people space to feel pain, right?
Yes.
Because you're meant to be, hey, back at work tomorrow morning, 7:30,
yes,
right?
Yes.
No time, your baby's dead, get back to work, right?
Yes.
I mean, to use a very extreme form of grief.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for those who are subscribers, you know the drill. If you have been a long-time listener or are a new listener but are not a subscriber to Hidden Forces, you can learn more about the subscription at hiddenforces.io/subscribe, or you can head straight over to patreon.com/Hidden Forces, and you can find out about all the different subscription tiers. If you want access to this week's rundown, there's a tier for that as well. I highly recommend it. It's full of all sorts of great links and materials and images and all sorts of outlines around Johann's book, or you can just buy Johann's book and just take my word for it. It's a phenomenal book. So stick around, Johann.
And there is an audio, I get told off by my publishers if I don't say this, there is an audio book of the book as well, and if anyone wants any more information about the book, if they want to take a quiz to see how much they know about the causes of depression and anxiety, or they want to listen to audio clips of loads of the people that we've been talking about, you go to www.thelostconnections.com, and there's like where you can follow me on social media and all that stuff too.
Exactly. I can recommend Johann's book, and he did the commendable job of narrating it himself.
Oh, hooray.
Yeah, so if you love his voice, which I told him is before we started recording, it's a pleasant mix between very street UK language and more posh language, something in between, which is very nice. Johann, stick around and we'll get into the solutions that you talk about in the book, or some of the sort of, ways forward, and also
Brilliant.
the psychedelic stuff.
Hooray.
And that was my episode with Johann Hari. I want to thank Johann for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studios in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.